Madam Speaker.
Treasurer.
I rise to deliver the Ministerial report on managing Labor's debt legacy notified on 11th of March 2006, and I move that the report be noted. Madam Speaker, I rise this morning to provide a Ministerial report on the work that the CLP government is doing to manage Labor's debt legacy. And Madam Speaker, debt is not an abstract line in a budget paper. It is not a debating point, and it's not a slogan for a press conference. Debt determines how much room a government has to keep funding schools, hospitals, police, corrections, housing and roads before interest and past mistakes start taking their first cut. And that is why this matters, Madam Speaker. Because when a government weakens the balance sheet year after year, it does not just leave behind a number. It leaves behind less freedom, less flexibility and fewer choices for the Territory. Madam Speaker, when we look honestly at the situation this government inherited, three very distinct themes stand out. Labor left the Territory with a lack of growth, a lack of certainty and a lack of security. Those three phases explain both the debt problem and the wider economic problems Territorians experienced over the past decade. Because there was one area where Labor did deliver growth, Madam Speaker, and that was debt. When Labor came to office, net debt was about $2.3 billion. And by 2023-2024, the audited figure had risen to just over $9 billion. By the time we inherited Labor's 24-25 budget, it was clear that the debt was projected to reach the $15 billion debt ceiling by 28-29. And that's why Labor created a $1.4 billion budget black hole so that they didn't need to front up and tell Territorians that Labor government was on track to breach its own self-imposed debt cap. That's $1.4 billion our government had to find to keep the lights on, Madam Speaker. Programs like the $120 million NT Health base budget pressure funding, which ceased under Labor on 30 June 2025, which we reinstated. $22.5 million of funding ceased on 30 June 2025 for domestic family violence programs, which we have now funded ongoing, Madam Speaker, in the budget at a higher amount. $19.3 million of funding which ceased on 30 June 25 for a range of tourism initiatives, including marketing, business events and Aboriginal tourist industry development. $15 million of funding ceasing 30 June 25 for youth justice accommodation facilities and $9 million funding ceasing on 30 June 26 for the Aboriginal Justice Agreement initiatives, law and justice groups, community courts and community-based sentencing. And as a result of all of this, Madam Speaker, Labor's debt legacy was $10.5 billion by the time they were thrown out of office. Madam Speaker, this raises a very simple question. What did Territorians receive in return for this mountain of debt run up by Labor over 8 years? Madam Speaker, when governments borrow money, there is an important distinction. There is good debt and then there is bad debt. Good debt builds productivity, builds infrastructure and supports economic growth. Bad debt simply funds the gap between spending and revenue. Madam Speaker, this is the point that goes to the heart of Labor's debt legacy. Across its term of office, Labor ran cumulative operating deficits of over $4 billion. That matters because operating deficits do not build roads, they don't build hospitals and they don't build a school. Operating deficits do not leave behind a productive asset that Territorians can actually see or use. They just simply add to debt. So when net debt increases by over $7 billion and around $4 billion of that increase is tied to cumulative operating deficits, Territorians are rightly entitled to ask a very direct question, Madam Speaker. What did we get for it? What did Territorians receive for $7 billion in extra debt? Because if debt is taken on to build long-term infrastructure, people can actually see the result, Madam Speaker. They can drive on it, they can use it, they can point at it. But when billions are borrowed just to cover the gap between day-to-day spending and day-to-day revenue, there is nothing to point to except a large interest bill and a weaker balance sheet. And that's why this matters, Madam Speaker. And that's why people ask the question. And that's why Labor's record is so poor. When the Leader of the Opposition says Territorians felt let down by Labor, that may be the most accurate thing she's ever said about Labor's economic record. A very large share of the debt Labor added was not debt for nation-building assets, it was debt used to fund operating shortfalls. Debt with no lasting return, debt with no visible legacies, and debt that left the next government with the bill but not with any benefit. And the operating results tell the story, Madam Speaker. Over 8 years in office, Labor achieved an operating surplus only once, just once. Every other year finished in deficit. So while debt continues to rise, the books almost never balanced. Now, Madam Speaker, Labor did deliver infrastructure projects over that period, and of course no one will deny that. But when Territorians look at the massive increase in debt, they're entitled to expect strong results. They're entitled to expect a clear legacy of productive assets. Instead, too often, what we saw were delays, cost pressures, unfinished works and a balance sheet carrying more and more strain. Legacies such as the Shiplift project mired in delays and cost blowouts. A half-finished art gallery which was not even funded for its operations when completed. An overpass at an additional cost of $100 million. $100 million over budget, Madam Speaker. That is what happens when governments lose focus on economic growth. Instead of growing the economy, Labor simply grew the debt. And what makes it even more serious is this, Madam Speaker. Labor was warned. They commissioned reviews. They received expert advice. They accepted the recommendations. They set themselves fiscal repair targets. Yet even after all of that, Madam Speaker, they still left the Territory with a balance sheet under severe pressure. So this was not a problem they failed to notice. Madam Speaker, this was a problem that they actually failed to fix. The first major remission came in 2019, the Root and Branch Review. That review was supposed to identify savings across government, rationalise programs, reduce duplication, restrain growth in costs and contribute to repairing the budget. In other words, Labor itself acknowledged that the cost base had drifted too far and that the budget could not continue on the path that it was on. And who can forget to remember the events of 2019 where the previous Treasurer at the time, Nicole Manderson, came out and debt was projected to rise to $35 billion. And debt just kept rising, Madam Speaker. Deficits remained embedded. The structural repair did not materialise even after all of that. The Root and Branch Review did not become the turning point it was sold as. Then came the Fiscal Strategy Panel, the Langland Review. And this wasn't just some minor internal checkup. This was Labor's flagship budget repair process. And that panel delivered 76 recommendations, Madam Speaker. And Labor accepted the overwhelming majority and told Territorians it had a credible plan to repair the budget. The panel's reforms were meant to reduce expenditure materially over the decade and return the budget to balance by 28-29. Labor then went further in its own 2019 budget and said the Territory was projected to achieve a fiscal surplus by 27-28. Well, Madam Speaker, how did that work out? Sadly, I think we all know. So let's be very clear. Labor was not lacking advice. What Labor was lacking was not just a roadmap. Labor was not lacking in warnings about what would happen if the Territory stayed on a business-as-usual path. The panel said the Territory needed stronger budget discipline, clear accountability, cultural change in spending control and a serious effort to restore fiscal sustainability. And yet what happened? Well, Madam Speaker, those objectives slipped. The repair drifted and by the 24-25 budget, Labor's own figures no longer had the Territory returning to fiscal surplus by 27-28, or even by the panel's 28-29 target. The return to surplus had slipped out to the 29-30 budget, way out there in the never. Net debt remained elevated. Debt ratios remain far above any prudent long-term benchmark, and that is not what success looks like, Madam Speaker, after years of claiming to have a plan to fix the budget. And when you look at the implementation record, the pattern is surprisingly the same. Labor liked to talk about accepted recommendations, but really what mattered was delivery. Several years later, important reforms were still incomplete, diluted or simply not pursued in the form of that they were recommended. Then, when this effort failed to solve the deeper problem, Labor commissioned yet another major review, the Territory Economic Reconstruction Commission. And yet again, Madam Speaker, here is that all too familiar pattern. Another commission, another blueprint, another promise that this time the Territory would be transformed by strategy, reform and implementation. This review was broader than pure budget repair. It was about economic reconstruction, investment and growth. But the political pattern was the same. When one set of reviews failed to deliver the promised turnaround, of course the answer then was another review. Root and branch was meant to find savings. The fiscal strategy panel was meant to deliver structural repair. 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘼 was meant to drive reconstruction and growth. Yet by the time Labor left office, the Territory was carrying heavy deficits, high debt, a weak fiscal position, and a forward profile that left the next government to confront those consequences. Review followed review. Announcement followed announcement. But the core outcomes did not move where Labor said that they would. Madam Speaker, this is the heart of the Labor debt legacy. Not just that they borrowed more, but that they borrowed more after acknowledging the problem, after receiving that expert advice and after publicly committing to a series of repair objectives that they just did not meet. Madam Speaker, Labor's second failure was a lack of certainty. Economic growth depends on confidence. Businesses invest when they believe the policy environment is stable. Workers move when they believe opportunities exist. Investors commit capital when they believe the future is predictable. But under Labor, deficits became routine, debt climbed and repair timetables slipped. And reform programs were repeatedly revised, rebadged or delayed. And Madam Speaker, that does not create certainty. All it creates is hesitation. It creates doubt. And in a small economy like ours, doubt is expensive. Because investors and businesses ask a very simple question. Is this a place where the economic settings are stable? For too long under Labor, the answer was a resounding no. By the time this government came to office, the Territory was facing not only excessive debt, but a forward fiscal profile that required hard decisions to restore control. Borrowing requirements were escalating, and the Territory was on track to accumulate even more debt without the certainty that comes from a disciplined and credible fiscal strategy. Madam Speaker, this government is determined to change that. We are restoring certainty through disciplined budgeting, through clear fiscal strategy, Madam Speaker, and through policies that support long-term investment into the Territory economy. Madam Speaker, Labor's third failure was security. When we came to office, the Territory was not only dealing with fiscal problems, we were dealing with a serious crime problem that was undermining community confidence right across the Territory. Businesses were facing break-ins. Families were questioning whether their communities were safe. And when community safety deteriorates, economic confidence deteriorates as well. Because a place that feels unsafe, Madam Speaker, struggles to attract workers, families and investment. Restoring community safety is therefore not just a policing issue, We've always said this, Madam Speaker, it's also an economic issue. And that's why restoring security across the Territory has been one of this government's first priorities and still remains a very high priority for us. Because security builds confidence, Madam Speaker. Confidence supports investment, and investment then supports growth. Madam Speaker, this government has taken a different approach. Where Labor delivered a lack of growth, we are focused on economic growth. We understand that the Territory cannot repair its finances by squeezing a stagnant economy. It repairs its finances by backing investment, backing enterprises, backing development, and expanding the revenue base through more activity, not through more tax. Madam Speaker, where Labor created uncertainty, we are restoring certainty and fiscal discipline. Madam Speaker, we are making the hard decisions. We've been very upfront about the scale of the repair task. We didn't hide those program funding cliffs, and we got criticised by increasing the spend in our last budget. But there's a reason we did that, Madam Speaker. Rather than try and hide the true cost of what it takes to do business here in the Territory and the things that government has to do to support our community, to try and hide those so they don't show up in the forward estimates, we actually put them in there, Madam Speaker, so the Territorians actually know and the government actually knows what the cost of doing business is. We are not trying to hide those costs into the outer years, Madam Speaker. We need to know what they are so that we can have that budget discipline to make sure that we don't go down the same road as Labor. But also, Madam Speaker, we've put in place a more disciplined framework for the future. Where Labor allowed community confidence to deteriorate, we're restoring security. Because without security, there is no lasting confidence. And without confidence, there is no serious investment story for the Territory. There's already evidence that the trajectory is changing. In the 25-26 mid-year report, we show revenue improving from $10.042 billion to $10.659 billion. It shows that the fiscal deficit is improving from $1.308 billion down to $961 million, Madam Speaker. Those numbers are going in the right direction. It shows net debt improving from $12.19 billion down to $11.712 billion. That gives us the money to do the things that we want to do. It shows net debt to revenue improving from 121% down to 110%. Now, Madam Speaker, no one on this side of the House is pretending that the repair task is easy. It certainly is not. And I know that we are doing the hard work to make sure that our fiscal trajectory is far, far different to that of the previous Labor government. The Territory, though, still faces a significant challenge, but the metrics are slowly improving. Madam Speaker, the direction is changing, and that change is a result of a government that understands three very simple priorities: growth, certainty and security. Those are the foundations of a stronger Territory economy. And they are the foundations of responsible fiscal management. The lessons of the past 8 years, Madam Speaker, are not complicated. You cannot spend your way around a structural problem. You cannot borrow your way to discipline. You cannot review your way to reform unless you're actually prepared to deliver it. And Madam Speaker, Labor was warned. Again, Labor accepted the advice. Labor set the targets, and Labor still failed to achieve the objectives it set for itself. Madam Speaker, this government will not make that mistake. Madam Speaker, we will do the hard work. We are and will restore discipline. We will rebuild confidence. And we will manage Labor's debt legacy in the interest of the Territory's future, because that's what good governments do, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, that is the task before us, and that is exactly what we, the CLP government, will do. Thank you.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And let's start with the obvious question. Why are we even debating this today? Madam Speaker, the answer is simple, because the government has absolutely nothing else to talk about. Actually, no, let me correct myself. They are starting to have an interesting pattern where they are obsessed with talking about Labor rather than talking about the practical things that they are going to implement. We heard a lot of fluff from the Treasurer just then, a lot of words, but not a single piece of reform, not a single policy, not a single piece of infrastructure, enabling infrastructure that will build the Territory's economy towards the future. So the new obsession that is starting, maybe it's a 2026 obsession, and that's great because we love talking about Labor values too, is that the CLP is currently in a pattern spiralling where any question, any topic, rather than talking about what they're doing as a government, is starting to be obsessed with talking about Labor. And today, in particular, Madam Speaker, and perhaps for the rest of the fortnight of sittings, we know the CLP's legislative agenda is extremely thin, so empty that they've dragged on this ministerial statement to talk about Labor's so-called debt legacy just to fill the parliamentary program this morning. Madam Speaker, this Treasurer has been in the job now for over 18 months. Yet the only substantial thing that he has contributed to the parliament is a speech about the previous government. Not a plan, not reform, and not serious economic strategy. Just another attempt to blame someone else. The CLP Treasurer just spoke and said a different approach. Well, different approach of not investing in what people want to see across the Territory. You're definitely taking that approach, Treasurer. And the irony of all this, Madam Speaker, is that the Treasurer, 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘏, now holds the crown as the Treasurer who has presided over the highest debt of any Treasurer in Northern Territory's history. Now, talking about history, the Treasurer was anointed the shadow Treasurer in opposition so he could shore up the leadership numbers for Chief Minister 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘏. He was maybe the balancing number. There was only 7 towards the end of last term, so 3 versus 4, and 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼 got the shadow treasury, so bang, he stuck on the Chief Minister's side. He shored up her leadership, and that's the reason why he's the Treasurer today, Madam Speaker. And judging of what we've seen so far, Territorians should be worried, because the Treasurer, when he handles the books, even the crops start saving for a rainy day, Madam Speaker. And when we've seen what the Treasurer is willing to do to tell fibs to Territorians, to make election commitments to Territorians, and then to break those promises several months later in the very first Territory budget. Key financial commitments that were promised to Territorians when they voted, scrapped, broken, Madam Speaker. So that's the lengths the CLP will go. We'll put up something nice and shiny that sounds great, like let's commit to the Aboriginal Ranger program for 4 years of funding, $12 million. Oh, sorry, when we get into government, that election commitment doesn't mean jack all, so we're going to scrap it. We lied to you, and, you know, we don't care about Aboriginal Rangers, and that was just a promise that looked good on a piece of paper before we got into government. So they should be ashamed, Madam Speaker, lying to Territorians, promising one thing, getting into government and completely changing their minds about what they're going to actually deliver for Territorians. It's disgraceful. And let's remember something else, Madam Speaker. One of the first things the Treasurer did when he took office was to scrap the debt ceiling, which had been in place under the previous government. Those guardrails existed for a reason. They were discussed and recommended through an expert group with the Territory Economic Reconstruction Committee, led by many diverse leaders in the economy across the Territory. Those guardrails, Madam Speaker, were there to impose discipline on government spending. But the Treasurer's approach was simple: remove the ceiling and hope that nobody noticed. Well, Madam Speaker, from the 18 months that I've been in this job and from the work I've done since the first budget of the CLP government in May 2025, I can tell you that people have noticed it. The business community is extremely concerned about it because it signals that this CLP government intends to open the floodgates to unchecked spending. The Treasurer's own mid-year report shows the territory debt under the CLP will rise by almost an additional $2 billion over the forward estimate. So go check that, CLP members. Go and make sure that you've done your homework just as much as we have. And now that we're hearing the next CLP budget may well crash straight through those very limits that existed, which Labor put in as safety guardrails. Madam Speaker, this is why many business in the community are deeply alarmed. It's also the real reason that the Treasurer has brought on this nonsense report today to try and deflect from the pain that he's about to inflict on Territorians in the budget of next sittings in May. And what does that lot over there in the CLP have to show for it, Madam Speaker? Absolutely nothing. Not a single new project, no economic plan, no vision for the Territory. Madam Speaker, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. As everybody in this place knows, the Treasurer who went fishing days before the CLP's first budget left it up to the hard-working public servants to make sure everything was in check. That's how much he cared about the Territory's economy. That's how much he cared about the Territory's budget. That's how much he cared about making sure that Territorians have an economic strategy into the future. He just went fishing. And Madam Speaker, instead of sitting down and doing the hard work required to produce a serious debt reduction strategy, the Treasurer packed his tackle box. While Territorians needed a cost of living lifeline, the Treasurer seemed more interested in his fishing lines. Now he's casting off his responsibilities while reeling in more debt for Territorians. And the only thing the Treasurer is balancing, Madam Speaker, is excuses. And let's look at the CLP's economic record so far. They created a Territory Coordinator with great fanfare, promised he would unlock investment, promised he would create jobs.
Okay, silence, please.
I don't think the CLP backbenchers understand what their Territory Coordinator's done so far. Absolutely nothing. Because not a single delivery of any single job. No new projects delivered or focused on under the Territory Coordinator. The shiplift was already a project started under Labor. So nothing new there, Madam Speaker. In fact, the CLP government seemed to have so little confidence in the Territory Coordinator, in the Treasurer, that the Treasurer didn't even attend the Territory Investment Summit. Imagine that. The Territory's so-called Minister for the Economy, considered so ineffective that he would add no value whatsoever to the Territory's own hosted investment summit. And that's about it. The page is pretty bleak and blank after that, yet somehow CLP continues to have spiralling debt, Madam Speaker. We've heard lectures about fiscal responsibility from the Chief Minister, and doesn't she love to lecture? Or let's remember the Chief Minister's track record, Madam Speaker. Her big economic solution in the past and the team that she represented was selling off TIO, a decision that left Territorians exposed to skyrocketing insurance costs. And then there was the sale of Port Darwin, which has upset many people, not just in the Territory and the country, but overseas as well. $1 billion mistake so catastrophic that the same people who supported it now want the Commonwealth to buy it back. That is not economic management, Madam Speaker. That is economic vandalism. Meanwhile, this Treasurer is building a reputation for not building projects. He is building a reputation for killing off projects, Madam Speaker. Bill Yan, the Treasurer, will be remembered as the person who killed off the Alice Springs Art Gallery and stopped the Darwin State Square Art Gallery and tried to repurpose it, only to discover that the community and anybody putting in an expression of interest wants it to remain an art gallery. Fancy that, Madam Speaker. Every single EOI in the State Square Gallery project has been about it remaining as an art gallery. Fancy that. You couldn't make this stuff up, Madam Speaker. And what about the biggest issue facing Territorians right now? Cost of living. Did we hear from the Treasurer? Ladies and gentlemen, do we hear from the Treasurer about how the CLP is going to support the cost of living pressures for Territorians in his 20-minute report back to the Parliament? Did we? No, absolutely not. And even yesterday, Madam Speaker, we heard the government backlift on fuel policy. No plan, no reform, just another broken promise to Territorians. Power prices are at record highs. Insurance costs are rising. Fuel prices are rising, and the Treasurer's response is to try and deflect attention by talking about the CLP's favourite subject, Labor. And since the CLP keeps raising Labor's debt record, let's talk about the reality. Debt increased for two very clear reasons. First, massive GST cuts by the federal coalition, cuts that the current Chief Minister supported when she backed her coalition federal colleagues. Shame. And secondly, Madam Speaker, COVID-19, a once-in-a-generation pandemic that required governments to step in to protect the lives and livelihoods of their fellow Territorians and Australians. Just remember, Madam Speaker, 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘼𝘀𝘍, the now Chief Minister, when she was the opposition leader, advocated to give away the COVID-19 vaccinations to New South Wales. She said it publicly on radio, Madam Speaker. Give away territory vaccinations meant for Territorians to New South Wales, Madam Speaker. And thank goodness she was in opposition at the time, because we wouldn't have seen the outcomes of saving lives and livelihoods as we did when Labor was in government. Madam Speaker, the CLP should answer a very simple question. Which Territorians would they have preferred to abandon? Which Territorians should have lost their jobs? Which businesses should have lost their livelihoods? Or should they have picked lives over certainty so that the government could have saved a few dollars? Let's get them to answer that question in the report today. Madam Speaker, we are seeing the same values of the CLP right now in time of crisis, with the disasters happening right across the Northern Territory with severe weather events. The CLP is shamefully picking and choosing which Territorians deserve support and which don't. Thankfully, Madam Speaker, after days of questions in this place, the pressure and being able to get more national exposure for the selection of which Territorians deserve support or not by the CLP government, we have seen the federal government step up and offer relief disaster support for all of the Territory. Central Australia and Barkly were announced today. More local government areas in the Big Rivers region was announced today after questions we asked yesterday, which will include people in my electorate of Arnhem in the Roper Gulf region, and it will include more people in the member for Daly's electorate, with the West Daly and Vic Daly local government areas now being officially on the disaster relief record. Thank you to Minister Kirsty Bain for her work in that space. And she is travelling to Katherine today. Look forward to hearing how that trip has gone and what further support that the federal Labor government stands by to assist for the Northern Territory, and continue to ask, and I'm not above begging, Madam Speaker, but to ask the CLP government and the Chief Minister to swallow her pride and her arrogance and her ego and ask for Australian Defence Force assistance with the flood recovery, which is going to be completely stretched over the Northern Territory. I think everyone in here knows that. It's no surprise now of what the catastrophic tasks will be ahead for many Territorians, visitors, and there's some devastating stories in my hometown and my region and my electorate. People have lost their livelihoods in extremely distressing circumstances, Madam Speaker. Now is not the time to be arrogant. Now is the time to ask for help, to get the ADF in. They stand ready and capable, as I understand, particularly in my electorate of Arnhem. We have the RAF-based Tyndall, over 500 personnel there who could be deployed. If the Chief Minister, 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘼𝘍, could swallow her pride and ego and ask for that assistance, I think they would be ready to go today, Madam Speaker. So let's hope that that happens. We've got local government areas now expanded in today's media release through the federal government support. It's not going to come out of the pockets of Territorians. It's going to come out of the pocket of Canberra, which it should, Madam Speaker. It's a natural disaster. We are all aware of that. Nobody's fault, but of course you'll probably hear the CLP say it was Labor's fault, it rained and flooded. That's how petty they are. Just ask for the support. Please, 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 if I need to beg, I will. Please, please, please get the Australian Defence Force to assist the Northern Territory with flood relief disaster areas right across the Northern Territory. People are exhausted. The vicarious trauma is phenomenal. Please just ask for that support is what I'm asking, what I'm begging if you need to. Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, this ministerial statement tells us everything. That the Treasurer Bill Yan and his team have no economic strategy, have no credible debt plan, have no cost of living agenda, and have no infrastructure pipeline to create jobs across the Northern Territory. Just Blain. And the Treasurer Bill Yan keeps running the Territory finances the way he is now, then someone really should take the credit card off him and send him back out on the boat and back out fishing. Madam Speaker, the Treasurer is the bill that the Territory cannot afford.
Member for Goyder.
Madam Speaker, and I'm not sure why exactly the member for Arnhem, the opposition leader, hates recreational fishing so much in this territory. They certainly bring it up a lot, brings a lot to the Territory economy, and sometimes people deserve to have a well-earned break. They're still on call, they can go for a flick. But instead, what we just heard was, you would remember, Madam Speaker, after the 2016 election, when the CLP was justly wiped out of this parliament down to 2 great members, the first thing Gary Higgins said was sorry. The first thing he said was sorry. We'd lost the people's trust. We still not have heard that from the Leader of the Opposition or her team. Now, where we are at is when Labor came to government, that we left them with $2 billion in debt. At 2023-24, the audited net debt was $9 billion, an increase of about $6.7 billion. Net debt to revenue rose from 35% to 108%. And the worst thing about all this overspending is about $4 billion of that increase in debt was associated to operating costs. Not capital investment, not looking for the Territory's future, but for operating deficits. And Madam Speaker, there was only one audited operating surplus in Labor's term. However, no fiscal balance surplus was ever achieved. The debt trajectory they left Territorians and tried lying about prior to the election had debt heading to a trajectory of about $15 billion. There was a $1.4 billion funding gap in forward estimates at the change of government. Now, Madam Speaker, what we've done is, instead of hiding these funding cliffs in the budget and the forward estimates, is we've put them in there. We're going to fund legal aid into the future. We all know that. Why would we have a funding cliff? It doesn't make sense. Other programs where there's no ongoing funding that clearly need to be funded each and every year, that's now in the budget paper, so that the true state of the Territory can actually be monitored. It's all well and good to say next year we're going to have a $15 billion surplus. We're going to have all these wonderful estimates, but if the numbers aren't real, then it's worth nothing. And what we heard today from the Leader of the Opposition again is, I don't even know how she got onto the floods, to be honest, Madam Speaker, but she bounced around a bit. But what we heard was the Territory Coordinator isn't doing enough. And yet, a couple months ago, I was told by the Leader of the Opposition that the Territory Coordinator was basically the end of the Territory, but now they're not doing enough. They can't help themselves. They can't keep a consistent position. They should be loving if the Territory Coordinator is working very hard, might I add, Madam Speaker, declaring the first Territory Development Area. And I heard the member for Johnston say $20 million office. Well, you know, the thing with these projects, Madam Speaker, is we do this thing where people get employed, and these are people who live in the Territory, and they get employed to do a job, and sometimes there is a big lead time, setting up the doing the business case, doing the reports, going all the way through the process. And unfortunately, we do pay our public servants, right? They are lovely people. They are fantastic, hard-working. But when people complain about the cost of an office, it's not the cost of office parties and drinking. I'm sure that happened under the previous government, but not under ours. It's the cost of employing Territorians. It's the cost of somebody doing their work, going to work, doing their 40 hours or 50 hours, whatever it might be. And unfortunately, we don't live in the communist society that some people might wish we did, but we do pay people for their labour. Now, Madam Speaker, I think it is important to note that Labor's biggest area of growth in the previous 2 terms was not the economy, it was the debt. And what happens when you have debt, Madam Speaker, is this really unfortunate thing is you've got to pay it back. And what that means is every year we're spending somewhere in the tune, I believe, about $500 million. Someone's hopefully going to correct me if I'm way off the tune, but it was over $1 million a day last time I looked at it in interest payments. Not paying down the principal, interest payments. Now, Madam Speaker, I know you're a strong advocate for saying we need a new hospital in your part of the world. I would love my Humpty-Doo hospital as well. I don't think I'm going to get that before you get yours. But you want a new Alice Springs hospital? Let's say it costs $750 million. All right? We're currently we'll spend that in, 18 months? Just servicing debt. $4 billion of operational debt. And they can blame COVID, but the reality is, Madam Speaker, COVID hit in 2020. It didn't hit in 2016, didn't hit in 17, 18, maybe the last half a month in 19. But there was 4 years there where the trajectory was on the path. They were hemorrhaging money. And the systematic way they'd set up the territory's finances from what they inherited put us on the trajectory to go to incredible levels of debt prior to COVID. Now, Madam Speaker, there is a massive flood recovery effort going on, as the Leader of the Opposition mentioned, and that is going to cost money. But we're not going to be sitting here in 2032 saying that the economy for the entire, 13, 15, 20 years the CLP's in government this time is based off one year of response. We're not going to be doing that because it's just a clear deflection. Everything's to do with COVID. Everything's a COVID problem. What about the 4 years before COVID? What about the 2 years after the clear recovery period? There's no excuses. There's no actual... It frustrates me, Madam Speaker, because it's one of those mistakes the Leader of the Opposition doesn't have to own. She could easily get up in this place and say, yeah, mistakes were made. We spent more money than we had. And the most disappointing thing about spending that money they didn't have is what they'll do is they put program after program, project after project on the program saying, we're going to build this. You're going to get a new health clinic here, a new police station, a new whatever you want. You want a water park, you're getting a water park. But we're never going to put money on it. And Madam Speaker, if I gave you an unlimited credit card and I said, make it rain for Alice Springs, wouldn't you make it rain for Alice Springs? Wouldn't they have made it absolutely rain in their communities and their parts of the territory? No, they front-loaded the Darwin suburbs. They neglected the rural area. They neglected and probably lied to the Bush ministers and the Bush members of their caucus. And they didn't deliver on the projects they keep promising. Oh, next year. We could have had a Labor government until 2050 and they'll still be talking about the same projects. It's a consistent, constant lie. And Madam Speaker, for Selena, the Leader of the Opposition, my apologies, to get up here and just talk again and again about the CLP, I'll pay credit, we did put the word Labor's fiscal legacy, and it is. But she talked about leadership numbers and everything else, and it clearly shows her number one priority in this place is securing her own position as Leader of the Opposition. We saw it. She said that this week's agenda had nothing interesting. It was a light agenda. And the Leader of the Opposition might not care about DV murder victims and their families. They may not care about the sparkies out there who are getting caught down doing paperwork instead of doing real work. They may not care about the taxi drivers and the industry that we're helping to hopefully, we will pass it, I guarantee you, sort out some legislation, red tape cutting mechanisms this afternoon. They may not care that the bail legislation was an important piece of our platform and what is delivering for Territorians and keeping them safe. And maybe she doesn't care about local government. I know they don't support empowering the bush. That's why the Minister for Local Government will be bringing his Code of Conduct Stage 2 tranche changes for the local government area. Because the local government, and we're seeing it right now on the ground, they are the first point of contact for a lot of residents. Right? It's the Catherine Town Council who are on the ground first, and then obviously the NT comes in, the feds come in, but the local government is the closest anyone will ever be to government. I know we all think we're very high and important in this place. But the reality is more people interact with their local park, their rubbish pickup, than anything we decide directly in this place. And that's determined by their council. So if there's nothing interesting on the agenda, the Leader of Opposition, if she asks for a repair or she asks for the week off, I'm happy to give it to her next week. But I think it's absolutely missing the mark to come in here and say we've got nothing on the agenda this fortnight, and that talking about the economy is not worthy of happening in this place. I look forward to hearing the contributions of the rest of the Labor caucus, as well as the crossbench, and the rest of the 17 United CLP team. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Drysdale.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'll just start with a few rebuttals to the opposition leader. I've spoken at length on this topic, and so I'll just very simply, summing up the opposition leader's speech, I'll say, you don't get to crash the car and then turn around and blame the mechanic for the bill. And I'll leave it at that, because I've touched on it before, and I'll just leave it at that. The thing that we've done no new projects, I'd like to state on the record that in my own electorate, on the idea of student safety, we had incredibly unsafe drop-off area at Driver Primary School. Now, the previous government, for 8 years, had said it was on the program to do that upgrade, and we were having weekly near misses. Literally, one of the first things I did was take the minister and his whole team off the 5th floor, and I drove them down to Driver Primary School so they could see how dangerous it was. And we've got that project done. Work's happening now, and we should be opening it very soon. And so that was a direct investment into child safety in Palmerston, and I'm very proud that we delivered that project after the school being told for 8 years it was on the program. Well, we got it done straight away. I'd also just like to talk on the use of the ADF, and I just need the Chamber and Territorians, and I'm speaking as a former captain of the Australian Army on this matter. The decision to utilise the ADF will be for Federal Cabinet. I will not be weighing in on that decision. The people have given the power to Federal Cabinet, and they will use it. I just ask, when we talk about that use, the ADF are a professional group of soldiers. They are professional warriors with a very defined task. And when you use the ADF, you massively impact national security. You take and say, if we deploy one brigade, and like I said, that'll be for Federal Cabinet, and it is for them to balance the risk. When you deploy them, you take a huge amount of our national security out of the equation, and at a time when global threat levels are extremely high, making the expectation on Territorians that that is a good thing, I would really ask the member for Daly and the opposition leader to temper those comments and expectations, because we're in a global threat environment that it'll be for Federal Cabinet, but we've got to temper that. And I would say, as a former professional soldier, we don't go and say, are we going to deploy RDH, all the doctors and nurses? Because we all understand that immediately, that there's a huge flow-on implication. And we go, that's not a good idea. We need our health professionals doing health professional things. Well, we need our soldiers doing soldier things. And I know with the global threat environment right now, the training continuum and pressure they will be under, and making sure they are prepared to respond appropriately. So I just ask that when we talk about the ADF, we just do it in a mature way, and that there is real implications and flow-on effects to if they are utilised. I will support if Federal Cabinet utilise it, absolutely. That is the decision for Cabinet and the Prime Minister to make. So, coming back to the matter before us, Madam Speaker, before entering this House, I had my own business. I worked in construction, and managing the economy at a micro level was very real in my day-to-day life. It wasn't a theoretical idea. And in construction, which is an industry I love because we create, we genuinely create. So we create employment, which means people can create individual wealth. We create taxes, so we pay the state to deliver the services, and we create real productivity, tangible goods and services that benefit people. Madam Speaker, I have a Bachelor of Business. I understand the principles that come in line with these simple business day-to-day decisions. And the beautiful thing about it is it scales. It doesn't matter if you're a single parent living in Drysdale, the same rules apply to if you are the Treasurer of the Northern Territory. You have to live within your means, you have to balance the books, and you don't borrow money to keep the lights on. That is something all my constituents understand. And so when they see a government, like the previous government, disobeying those natural laws of economic management, then they understand things have gone awry and there's actual flow-on consequences. And under the last government, the people of Drysdale simply got poorer. That is the ultimate outcome that occurred. And even worse, with the debt, it now means for people my age, so the average age in Drysdale, Madam Speaker, is 34 years old. We are the youngest electorate, I believe, in the Northern Territory. There might be one the same, but we're incredibly young. People of my age will be paying off that debt for the rest of their working life, and their children will inherit probably some of that debt. And whilst it's being paid off, it means other things can't be given. Because remember, government, and I've said this before, government doesn't create. It takes with one hand and it wraps it up, spending money while it wraps, and gives with the other. Now, we all agree that there's essential things that needs to occur with. But when it comes to taking money off you as a citizen and wasting it on day-to-day operations, not investing as the people expect us to do, then we're depriving them of investment in the future. That's investment in health, investment in education. These interest payments are robbing us right now and will rob us for quite a long time of other investment that could have been created. So that is the real sin of mismanagement of your economy. So it's been noted the previous CLP government left a $2 billion debt, which sat at about 35% debt to revenue income. We've come in and we're sitting at 121% when we came in. That is mind-blowing. To put that in perspective, in 8 years, to go from 35% to 121%. The US economy did that same trajectory. So from 2007, at the start of the financial crisis, they sat at 35%. And then by 23-24, sat at between 105 to 108%. Now, in that time, they tried to rescue the largest economy in the world and prop up the global economy through the financial crisis, and tried to prop up theirs and the global economy through the COVID era. So we had the same level of debt, and you see one state, being that the US economy, trying to, and we can argue whether or not these decisions are correct, that's not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at the impact of a 35 to 121% debt. And here in the NT, what did we do? What did we honestly do with the huge level of debt increase? And that is the real shame, because I can't stand here and say, thank you, Labor, for delivering 100 years of water security, 100 years of energy security, the greatest health system in the country. I can't point to those things. I can't point to anything in my electorate. That was a real shame. But this is the position we have inherited. Now, I'm pleased to report that that 121% figure has dropped to 110% in our time. So we see movement coming down on that debt to revenue, and that is a very promising sign. We also see payroll tax revenue is up 10%. Again, own source revenue, which is the key, because we can only control what we can control. I see my time is up, and thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Gwoja.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I do certainly acknowledge the contributions that have been made this morning. Madam Speaker, Territorians should remember a time when the previous CLP government was in office and a series of decisions that permanently changed the Territory's economic landscape. Two of the most significant decisions, Madam Speaker, was the sale of TIO and the lease of the Port of Darwin. They were not small assets. They were Territory institutions built over generations. The Port of Darwin, a critical piece of infrastructure, a strategic getaway for trade, defence and economic development for the North. And TIO was more than just an insurer. It was a Territory-owned institution, Madam Speaker, that supported local jobs, reinvested profits locally and played an important role in shaping our economy. The previous CLP government chose to sell those assets. They argued that it would build the budget position and reduce debt. But many Territorians at that time, and they still feel it today, that these decisions were about making the budget books look better in the short term rather than protecting the Territory's economic interests. When governments sell strategic assets, Madam Speaker, they lose something permanent. They lose future revenue streams. They lose the control over important infrastructure, and they reduce the Territory's ability to shape its own economic future. Because once an asset like the Port of Darwin or the TIO is sold, it's something that we can't easily get back. Madam Speaker, this brings us to an important part that is often oversimplified in politics, and that is the issue of government debt. We often hear the claim that all debt is bad, that governments should never borrow money, and that we should avoid debt, and avoiding debt should always be something as a priority. But the reality is far more complex than that, Madam Speaker. Not all debt is bad. In fact, responsible governments sometimes need to borrow money to invest in the future, to keep the economy moving forward. We understand this in our own lives, Madam Speaker. Families borrow money to buy a home. Farmers borrow money to buy equipment. And businesses borrow money to expand business, to create jobs and to grow their business. They do this borrowing because, Madam Speaker, when done responsibly, it allows them to invest today in something that will deliver benefits for many years to come. The same principle applies to governments. Governments sometimes need to invest in major infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, housing and energy systems. These are long-term assets that serve our communities for decades. It would not make sense, Madam Speaker, to expect today's taxpayers to pay the full cost for a hospital or major highway upgrade up front when those assets will benefit generations of Territorians well into the future. Borrowing money allows governments to spend across time while delivering infrastructure our communities need today. Madam Speaker, infrastructure investment also supports the economy. When governments build roads, build hospitals, build homes, they create jobs for local workers, contracts for local businesses, and economic activity across the region. In times of economic uncertainty, Madam Speaker, governments play a role in investing. That's why economists often talk about the importance of productive debt, borrowing funds, investments which strengthen the economy and improve community well-being. Of course, government debt should always be managed responsibly. Governments should never borrow money without a clear commitment of how they're going to do that in the long term. But we should also avoid the mistake of treating all debt as if it's inherently bad. Because when governments fail to invest, communities fall behind. Roads deteriorate, hospitals become overcrowded, schools struggle to keep up with growing populations. And the long-term cost of fixing those problems becomes even greater. Responsible borrowing, when used to build infrastructure and support economic growth, is not and should not be a burden. It's an investment in jobs, an investment in community, an investment in the future. Madam Speaker, the real question is not whether governments should ever borrow. The real question is whether the money being borrowed is invested wisely. The lesson from the past is clear. Budgets should always not be balanced by selling off the Territory's future. They should be balanced through responsible planning, smart investment, and building a stronger economy for the long term. Madam Speaker, I don't often agree with members on the opposite side, but I do acknowledge that one of the biggest challenges the Northern Territory has is population growth. And the way to grow our economy is to grow the population. And whilst I might disagree often with the member for Fong Lim, I know that this is something that he is genuinely passionate about. And I know that if we can grow the Territory's population, which is currently declining, we can grow our economic prosperity and our economic opportunities. And to do that, Madam Speaker, you need to invest in infrastructure, in programs and services to attract people to the Territory. So there is significant work. The Territory has always had its financial challenges, and I'm not saying for a moment that every government previously has got it right, or that this government will have it right or not have it right. But the Territory does have structural issues that it needs to discuss with Canberra around legacy debt. When the Northern Territory was handed over and we got self-government, the Territory inherited ageing infrastructure, roads, housing, institutions, hospitals, all that was going to require significant investment, and there was never the financial investment from the Commonwealth to do that. So the Territory has always been behind. Regardless of who has been in power, the real issue here is the Territory has always been shortchanged by Canberra when it comes to our infrastructure. So there is a conversation that we should all be having as a parliament together, because as we continue, we are still going to always be behind, because that gap has never been filled in fixing that critical issue of the Territory's infrastructure legacy. We need to look at what that looks like. And the Territory has complex needs. We are not a Sydney or a Melbourne or a Victoria or a New South Wales, and I'm proud that we're not, because we're better than them. But, Madam Speaker, we have a dispersed population. We have an amazing population, but when people talk about delivering regional and remote services and this is how much money you should get to do that, you know, I always talk about local government. They do a great job. We've got people whinging on the East Coast about delivering local government services. I think there's two people in this room who know the most about local government. That's me. That is the local government minister as well, Minister Edgington. We hear all the time about these mob in the East Coast banging on about delivering services for local government, and they say that they're remote. And I've got to say, mate, Bendigo is not remote, or Wollongong is not remote. Ali Karung and Kintor are remote, and the financial assistance that we get doesn't allow us to deliver a quality job. So there are real issues that we need to talk about on a national stage around the Territory's economic future, and we should all do it together, because we want people, of course, the more people spend money in the Territory, the more that we can invest and grow the Territory's economy. How do we get more people to the Territory? How do we fix the legacy issues? And how do we communicate when they are looking at the GST? Because I know that WA, our cousins in the West, they always cry that they need more GST money, but we need more GST money, because the need to deliver services in the Territory is greater than anywhere else in the country. The remoteness is greater than anywhere else in the country apart from WA. So we need to have a conversation, because whenever there's a fluctuation in GST, there's a fluctuation in service delivery in the Territory. So we need to look at that. How do we have a real conversation? What does a budget compact look like in the Territory for the future, because they are the conversations that I want to have. They're the conversations I think that we all should be having in the Territory, because it doesn't matter who's in government, the Territory is always going to suffer economically until we get that recipe right and until we can have an honest conversation around what the future economically looks like in the Territory. But we do need to make sure that we are investing in important pieces of infrastructure and services so that we can keep people in the Territory moving forward and being strong. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I thank the Minister for his report on the Territory's economy, but what we've heard today is a familiar line, and it's important to unpick the budget myths perpetrated in this chamber. The Treasurer wants you to believe that running a deficit is the worst thing a government can do, but it's not true when the difference between spending more money and not is a hospital that functions and doesn't. Debt is not the most important consideration. The government's priorities are. The Treasurer would have Territorians believe that debt itself is the central problem facing the Territory, but that framing is misleading. As we've just heard, every government operates with some level of debt. That's not unusual. It's how our modern finance system, public finance system works. Governments build infrastructure that lasts decades. They invest in hospitals, in schools, in roads and housing that serve multiple generations. Borrowing to fund these long-term assets is normal practice across the world and across Australia. So the real question is not whether a government has debt. The real question is what that borrowing is used for and whether it improves the lives and the productivity of the people who pay for it. Focusing only on the headline debt figure becomes a distraction from the more important conversation about priorities. Governments are here to look after people, to maintain essential services and to make decisions about the priorities of the public. And when we have a government who refuses to collect more revenue from their multinational offshore gas company friends, who we currently get $0 tax from, in fact, we pay for them to be here through subsidies, revenue that could shorten wait lists at RDH, be used for public housing, for specialists, revenue that could pave some of the 75% of our roads that are unsealed, that could address public safety in sustainable ways, that could create more opportunities for young people who actually want to stay in the Territory. Madam Speaker, debt is not the problem here. It's what the government decides is a priority to spend money on. And you'll note I'm not talking about major projects here. We need essential services before major projects, not the other way around. My experience on the shiplift inquiry solidified that for me. So that's what we need to remember. Budgets are about choices. So next time you hear the Treasurer say the reason we can't have nice things is because of debt, remember that the government chooses what is important to spend our limited pot of money on. Debt, operating deficit, borrowing, none of this forces the government to subsidise the fossil fuel industry and not the hospital. That's a choice made on your behalf. When we have an economy that measures success through the well-being of multinational companies and big industry rather than the well-being of making the Territory what it is, then we have a problem. If the economy is supposedly growing, that means what's called gross state product is growing, yet Territorians are more stressed, tell us they feel more unsafe and are more unable to afford basic essentials with inequality growing, then we're measuring the wrong things and we're rewarding the wrong priorities. I'll say that again. If the economy is supposedly growing, yet Territorians are unable to afford basic essentials, then we're measuring the wrong things. Gross state product is not a useful measure for economic well-being. The Minister has given us the government's view of the economy. What he says is growth, certainty and security. But what the Treasurer can't explain is why Territorians are still struggling even when the economy is supposedly growing, and where all our needs-based funding is actually going. The Northern Territory gets almost 80% of our funding from the federal government, including 5 times the rate of GST funding compared to most other states and territories. And we get that to address our complex needs and remoteness. But when I asked the Treasurer how that needs-based funding is being tracked to make sure that it is actually addressing the need that it was intended to, the answer I got was, we don't track that. We don't track that? Madam Speaker, here is yet another issue worth talking about more than debt. Where is all the money that's meant to address that need going? So for Territorians who are sick of hearing budgets and economic plans that differ only in the margins, Whoever's in power, I'm here to remind you that we don't have to settle for tinkering around the edges. We can create a budget that fundamentally improves Territorians' lives. I think we can have an alternative vision, a wellbeing economy, an economy that actually puts the needs of Territorians first, that invests early to save later, and refuses to funnel public money into the pockets of multinationals while families struggle to meet basic costs. Because the truth is this: when people thrive, the economy thrives. And when people are struggling to survive, no spreadsheet can claim success. So, Madam Speaker, a wellbeing economy starts with a simple shift that the purpose of a budget is to meet the basic needs of Territorians, not the needs of corporate boardrooms in Sydney, Delhi or Tokyo. We could have a people's budget here, one that invests firstly in health, mental health, domestic violence prevention, frontline services, safe housing, homelessness services, renewable energy, local jobs, roads and community infrastructure that actually meet the needs of the people here in the Territory. These are investments that represent short-term costs but significant savings in the long term. They reduce hospital admissions, they reduce crime, they reduce homelessness, they reduce youth detention, and they reduce long-term government spending. So investing early is not just compassionate, it's economically responsible. Right now, too much of our budget is built on reaction rather than prevention, and on subsidies for big corporations instead of support for just normal, everyday people. That's not a strategy, that's committing to an ongoing cycle of crisis. Madam Speaker, once again, this debate in this chamber is focused around blame across the chamber from party to party and focusing on the past. I think we need to focus on the future. I believe that we can build a budget for the Territory that's actually based around people's needs, a budget that says we need to put people first. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Karama.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And can I thank the Treasurer for his ministerial report on managing Labor's debt legacy. And like him and the rest of our team, I am focused on our key priorities of growth, certainty and security. And let's look at each of these priorities separately to understand the extent of the impact of Labor's debt legacy. In doing so, Madam Speaker, let's look forward to see how we are going to move on serious task of budget repair. And we do have more budget repair to happen. So let's go to growth. We have a very clear indicator in the ComSec reports. As has been mentioned a number of times in this Assembly, under this government, the Northern Territory has moved from stone muddleless last to number 4 in the nation. Number 4 in the nation. And when I say stone muddleless last, I mean we'd been languishing in last position for approximately 3 years under the previous Labor government. There was no attempt to lift us. They actually tried to hide the ComSec report and say, oh, don't pay any attention to it. Don't listen to the evidence. They said, no, we don't want that. That goes against us. But within 18 months, we have created a business environment, and this is the key. We're creating a business environment where we are now 4th in the nation, and hopefully this will improve further in the future, Madam Speaker. And that is because we support the private sector and local business. We support the private sector and local business. We see them as being the key for growth, including all our small to medium business sectors across the Territory. And as outlined in our plan, I did this yesterday, but I'm going to repeat it again, Madam Speaker. We have focused on supporting growth in 5 critical industries: tourism, defence, agriculture, mining and gas. So when I hear the Leader of the Opposition say we have no plan, well, I'm sorry, that's where we've been focusing our efforts. And I just want to, let's use gas as an example, just as a clear example of the contrast between our government and the previous Labor government in regards to economic growth. Under our government, the Beetaloo gas development is now underway and offering significant opportunities for further local business and employment opportunities. It is really, and we've heard from the Minister of Business about the opportunities there. We've heard from the member for Barclay because it's land of opportunity down there. Everyone's talking about the growth and how our local businesses are getting involved down there. And, you know, think about that. But when under Labor, our onshore gas industry was stymied by Labor's inertia and indecision. Shame on them, shame. That's all they did. They just kicked the tin down the road. They couldn't make a decision. They didn't know whether they were Arthur or Martha. They were hopeless. And despite the bleedings of the opposition, I don't care what I hear there. I know from when I talk to business, go and talk to them firsthand, I can tell you business confidence is growing in the Territory. That's what businesses tell me. I don't need to hear second-hand, third-hand from the member for Johnston and others. I go out and talk to business directly. Now, certainty, as I said, that's another key focus of us. As I said, business confidence is growing because we've moved on from the inertia and decision of Labor. We're moving on from that. We unashamedly back local business. And may I say, I can't never forget this. I've had it written down here and I'm going to repeat it again. How can I not refer back to the speech by the member for Johnston who denigrated the importance of the private sector, which actually highlights why the Independents and Labor drove our ComSec ratings down to shame motherless last. This is their approach. But let me quote, we better go back to Hansard so we get this right, Madam Speaker. From the member for Johnston, major private investment has never played a major role in the NT economy and the standard of living for most Territorians, and it never will. Well, doesn't that send a lot of confidence to the private sector? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't, Madam Speaker. And also she has said, and I quote, major private development plays a minuscule role in the NT economy. Minuscule. That's another one of her words. So this is what we hear, Madam Speaker, and we can continue to hear the interjections coming through. But let's go back to gas. I heard the member for Johnston say, oh, the offshore gas industry, we get no royalties, there's no benefit in it. Well, those royalties, because they're offshore gas, actually go to the federal government. And she even acknowledged that we get 80% of our funding from the federal government. So it does go round in circles, but it comes back to us via those grants. But you're trying to take it away from Australia. You just think when no one's getting any benefits out of this. This is wrong. But more importantly, it's the onshore gas industry. The 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘏, those royalties come to us. They will be a source of own source revenue. And maybe you should focus on let's grow our own source revenue so that we don't have to stay wedded to the Commonwealth all the time and using all their money. This is what we need to do. And it's only this government that actually gets through that. And I just also probably want to go, I heard from the Treasurer, and let's go to the issue of security. Let's talk about security. Now, I heard from the Treasurer, the one thing that Labor had grown was debt. The one thing that Labor had grown was debt. Now, that's true, but it's not the only thing, Madam Speaker. I can tell you they oversaw a skyrocketing growth in crime and antisocial behaviour. Crime and antisocial behaviour across the Territory, and that in itself was sapping confidence out of the Territory, sapping confidence out of our business sector, sapping confidence out of our community. People were looking to pack up and leave. And as I said yesterday, I never forget walking around the shops of Karama the day after the election and there was a sudden change in optimism. They'd finally got rid of Labor. They knew they had a government that had a plan that were going to go on and make the Territory better. And that's what we've focused on. And they keep saying we haven't had a plan. I relayed yesterday, went through it. We have actually delivered what we said we were going to do. Despite all the bleedings of the opposition, we actually went ahead and did it. We did all our bail reform. We did a lot of that on urgency. Why? Because we'd already told the electorate what we were going to do. And if the one criticism we're going to get back from the opposition, and they reckon from the community, is that we're going to criticise you for delivering what you said you promised to the electorate, bring it on. Bring it on. I welcome that because I put my hand on the heart and that's a badge of honour. We delivered what we said we were going to do. And that's what we need to do more of, may I say, Madam Speaker. So just quickly, in terms of security, I know there's been some various crime stats circulated, the Attorney-General, but she mentioned yesterday, I think, victims of crime down by 2,700. Down by 2,700. That in itself is fantastic for our community, the community safety. We just need more of this. If I go back to some of the broad stats, just while I've got another minute or so, let's just have a look. This is from comparing January to December 2025 with January to December 2024, so year on year. NT, wide. Robbery offences down 20%. Total property offences down 12%. Burglary, dwelling, house break-ins offences are down 32%. Burglary, non-residential, commercial break-ins offences are down 27%. Motor vehicle theft and related offences are down 15%, etc. So this is what I'm telling you. The business community is out there. They're saying things are getting better. There's a lot more work to do. I'm the first to acknowledge there's a lot more work to do. We've got a lot more to do in terms of budget repair. We've got a lot more to do to get the economy growing even further than where we've started. We've only just started. We've got to keep focused on community safety. There's a lot more work to do in that, and I can tell you from my own electorate in Karama, I've mentioned before, I think we've got to go harder on public housing reform. That's one of the areas that people are asking, and I know we've got plans to do that, and I acknowledge the Minister there, and I'm very proud to be his Assistant Minister in this regard. But I can only say, I don't know how many times I have to say it, we told people what we were going to do. We're doing it, and we continue to do it. And if that's what people want to criticise us for, go for your life, because we're not going to just promise the sky and deliver nothing. That's not our DNA. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Wanguri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to speak on the Treasurer's ministerial statement and to reflect on the terrible, terrible financial legacy that the previous Labor government has left all Territorians. And when we talk about that legacy, there is one unavoidable truth. Under Labor, the Northern Territory did not see growth in our economy, and what we saw was the growth in that terrible debt. Labor's biggest area of growth was not jobs for our families. It was not private sector investment. It was not economic confidence. It was that terrible debt. When Labor came into office, Territory debt was around $2 billion. And I remind people, the Treasurer at that time was the previous member for Wanguri. By 2023-24, audited net debt had grown to just over $9 billion. That's an increase of roughly $6.7 billion in just 8 years. And I did previously work for the Commonwealth Bank, and they make that kind of profit in just 6 months to reinvest into their business. Madam Speaker, this is not a rounding error. This is a financial terrible legacy. And all our Territorians are now living with this consequence of the terrible fiscal legacy. Madam Speaker, the real issue is not just how much debt grew, the real issue is why it grew. Labor delivered only one audited operating surplus during that entire time in their office. One, the lowest number of the single digits, and every other year the Territory ran at a deficit. Year after year, budget after budget, deficit after deficit. And when deficits become normal, borrowing becomes normal, but that's not normal. That is exactly what happened under Labor. Labor normalised deficit, Labor normalised borrowing, and Territorians, all Territorians, are now paying the price. Now, I know members opposite do not like hearing that, but Madam Speaker, the numbers are not my opinion. They are the Territory's audited financial statements, and those numbers tell a very clear story. Around $4 billion of the increase in the Territory's debt was associated to operating deficits, member for Johnston, not infrastructure, as reminded also by the member for Goyder earlier. That means borrowing was used simply to cover day-to-day spending, not long-term assets, not economic capacity, not infrastructure that drives our productivity. Just the gap between spending and revenue, borrowing to keep budget afloat, borrowing to cover routine expenditure, borrowing because the books did not balance. Madam Speaker, debt itself is not always a problem, as we all know. Borrowing can make sense when it builds the future. Borrowing can support our roads we need, ports we need, hospitals we need, and our schools for our children. Borrowing can strengthen the economy when it delivers lasting assets. But borrowing simply to cover everyday spending is not responsible financial management. This is not investment. That is avoidance. And under Labor, debt became the substitute for economic growth. Madam Speaker, strong economies support strong budgets. When an economy grows, government revenue grows with it. Growth expands, and just like the payroll tax base, growth increases royalties and growth increases business activity and transaction volumes, as we heard from the member for Karama. Growth strengthens the Territory's GST capacity. That is how a healthy economy supports public finances. But under Labor, the economy did not grow strongly enough to support the scale of government. Instead of growing the economy to support that budget, Labor grew the debt to support the budget. And that is the reality members opposite do not like to be reminded of again. Madam Speaker, another major failure of the previous government was the inability to grow the private sector, and I commend the member for Port Darwin, who's doing absolutely magnificent work around that. Private enterprises is the engine of economic growth, and businesses create jobs. Businesses drive investment, businesses expand, and the revenue base that funds our schools, our hospitals, and our police. But under Labor, private sector confidence weakened and investment did slow, and government spending increasingly filled those gaps. Labor relied heavily on public spending, supported by borrowing, and that approach may create the illusion of activity in the short term, but in the long term, it weakens fiscal resilience. Structural deficits became embedded and debt continued to rise. And that's what exactly happened in the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker. Territorians are entitled to ask a very simple question. What did the Territory receive for their nearly $7 billion of additional debt? I'm not sure. I think I'm reading it in lemon because there was nothing. What lasting economic strength was created? What productivity was delivered? What opportunity was built? Because the reality is too many projects under the previous government were characterised by delays, cost overruns and that poor planning. Projects ran over budget, projects ran over time, and public confidence suffered. Madam Speaker, the previous government did not only leave the Territory with a debt problem, they left confidence problem. Economic confidence rests on three foundations: certainty, security and discipline. Businesses invest where governments demonstrate clear economic direction. Investors look for jurisdictions that show fiscal responsibility, and we're turning that. Families choose to live where communities are safe and opportunities exist. And Madam Speaker, what matters in places like Wanguri is the families of Wanguri and the northern suburbs expect safe communities. They expect strong services and they expect a government that manages the Territory's finances responsibly. Because when debt rises, without economic growth, it is the local communities that feel that pressure. It is communities like Wanguri that depend on responsible budgeting to fund our schools, our health services, police and community infrastructure. Madam Speaker, this government has taken a fundamentally different approach. That's why there's a new Treasurer. The CLP government has clear priorities: reducing crime, rebuilding the economy and restoring the Territory lifestyle. Community safety and economic confidence go hand in hand, and businesses cannot invest where confidence is weak. Families cannot thrive where communities feel unsafe, and investors do not commit capital where certainty is lacking. Restoring safety is therefore not just a law and order priority, it's an economic priority. And Madam Speaker, rebuilding the Territory economy is central to repairing the Territory's finances for all Territorians. This government strategy is simple: grow the economy, not just balance the sheet. A stronger private sector reduces resilience on borrowing. A stronger investment pipeline creates jobs and opportunities. That's jobs and opportunities for all our Territorians. We're focused on attracting investment, expanding that private sector and developing the Territory's energy and resources sector, and strengthening logistics and defence opportunities. These are the foundations of long-term economic growth. Madam Speaker, we're already seeing early signs that the trajectory is starting to change. The mid-year budget review shows improvements across key indicators. Revenue has increased from approximately $10.04 billion to $10.66 billion. Now, Member for Johnston, they might be a small increase, but it's actually an increase. The fiscal deficit has improved from around $1.3 billion to about $961 million. Net debt projections have improved, and the net debt to ratio has improved from 121% to 110%. In other words, revenue is improving, deficits are reducing, and debt is stabilising. This is what we want. This is exactly responsible financial management looks like. And thank you to the Treasurer. Madam Speaker, repairing the Territory's finances will take time. The financial damage created over many, many years cannot be fixed overnight, but the direction now is clear. Under Labor, debt grew. Under this government, the economy will grow. Members opposite may not like hearing that, but the facts remain. Labor normalised deficits, Labor normalised borrowing, and Labor normalised debt. This is not fiscally responsible. This government is restoring discipline, this government is restoring confidence, and the government is rebuilding the Territory economy. But because the choice facing for Territorians is very simple, Labor grew the debt and the CLP is growing the economy. And Madam Speaker, that difference will define the Territory's future. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Berkeley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I really want to thank the Treasurer for bringing on this ministerial report this morning about managing Labor's debt legacy, and this is extremely important for the CLP as coming to government back in 2024, being faced with a debt tracking towards $15 billion. But I want to get some facts on the table, Madam Speaker. Territory's net debt was about $2 billion when Labor came into office back in 2016. By 23-24, audited net debt was around $9.018 billion. The audited 2016-17 net debt was around $2.271 billion. So it was already growing straight after Labor came into government back in 2016. The net to debt revenue ratio rose from 35% in 2016-17 to 108% by 2023-24. Madam Speaker, Labor achieved only one audited operating surplus in 8 years. Every other year was an operating deficit. When broader fiscal balance is used, the Territory remained in deficit every single year under Labor. But, Madam Speaker, debt is not abstract. It reduces future budget flexibility. Rising debt means higher interest costs and fewer choices. Debt growth over time reflects structural deterioration, not a one-off event. But, of course, as we've heard, not all debt is bad. The issue is whether borrowing funded productive assets or ongoing deficits. Too much of the Labor-era borrowing funded operating shortfalls rather than finished infrastructure. We have heard examples of the good debt, bad debt analysis. We know that good debt is about borrowing for productive assets, things like roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, logistics and enabling infrastructure. Bad debt, as we know, bad debt is about borrowing to cover day-to-day operating expenses. But when we look at what we're faced with, Madam Speaker, total increase in net debt over the Labor period was about $6.7 billion. But importantly, analysis of the Territory financial statements indicates around $4 billion of that increase was driven by operating deficits. So what did the Territory actually receive for nearly $7 billion in added debt? We know that that debt included, when we came to government, Madam Speaker, a structural budget deficit in the health system of around $300 million. $300 million, Madam Speaker, structural deficit in health. And these are the issues that we faced coming into government. But there was a number of projects which I do want to discuss, because when it came to investment by Labor, some of the investment decisions were particularly questionable, I would say. There was very little investment in community safety, critical infrastructure. There was no plan for the economy, Madam Speaker. And I must say that, and I said it many times while in opposition, Labor had no plan, and they genuinely had no idea. No idea. And that's what contributed to the debt that we're facing today, because there was no plan and they genuinely had no idea how to address community safety, how to address the critical shortage of infrastructure, and they had no idea how to grow the economy. That's why our focus is on reducing crime, rebuilding the economy and restoring the Territory lifestyle. So what did they spend money on, or what didn't they spend money on, which was critical? And I want to touch on some of the things in my electorate, Madam Speaker, because there was lots of promises made about building a new health centre in Borroloola. Well, guess what, Madam Speaker? That's what we're investing in. We've committed $20 million to build a new health centre in Borroloola. We're getting on with the job, and we're putting our money where it's really needed most. We also saw, Madam Speaker, the Labor government talking many, many times about investing in schools. The 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘏 school, which I've spoken about many, many times in this parliament, Labor did not contribute to the upgrade of the 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝑚 school. And that's a critical issue, Madam Speaker, because when we talk about health, education, community safety, there was also a commitment, a long-standing commitment under Labor to invest in staff accommodation for nurses at the Tennant Creek Hospital. That went on for 6 years, Madam Speaker. Whilst the debt was growing and wastage was occurring, they weren't investing in critical infrastructure such as nurses' accommodation. Even while growing the debt, Madam Speaker, they scrapped 2 bushfires NT positions in Tennant Creek, and what we saw in August to October 2023 was the worst bushfires in the Barkly during that period. They had scrapped 2 bushfires NT positions. It left us without the resources on the ground in Tennant Creek, and it left us facing an absolute disaster with those bushfires. And that's the type of investment that they were making. Investing in infrastructure that wasn't needed while scrapping important positions in my electorate, Madam Speaker. And I'll tell you what, I was absolutely fuming when they scrapped those positions in 2020. They didn't invest in the Youth Justice Facility in Tennant Creek. We finished that. We finished the 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘏 Art and Cultural Centre in Tennant Creek. There's still $5.5 million unaccounted for, which was promised by Labor in 2018 for turbocharging tourism. Nobody's ever seen or heard of it since they promised $5.5 million. The streetscaping project, CLP had to come into government to finish that project, even though it had been promised by Labor for 6 years. But what we do know is that they overspent the budget on a bridge on Tiger Brennan Drive by over $100 million. They built a police station at Nightcliff, which has been open between 8 and 4/21 Monday to Friday ever since they built it, at a cost of $12.7 million. They invested in a grandstand at Fannie Bay. They overspent $14 million on the Garramilla Boulevard. They spent $432,000 on a bus stop, which they moved from Kavanagh Street to Smith Street and then back again. So this is some of the this is what's contributed to the budget blowout that we're facing today, Madam Speaker. Complete mismanagement of the budget by Labor. We're facing the consequences of their mismanagement today. They spent $2.7 million on an unshaded structure on Kavanagh Street. I don't know how many times I've spoken about that. They even spent $80,000 to do a review of an unshaded structure in Kavanagh Street. $80,000 wasted on that, Madam Speaker. They overspent the 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝙏𝙀 Point playground by $2 million. There was an overspend on the demolition of the Chan building by $1 million. They spent $220,000 on a renewables targets report, which was made public after an FIO request, with every single page redacted. Every single page, after spending $220,000 on that. But, Madam Speaker, one of the issues that I want to talk about is they did have a tourism strategy called Boundless Possible, Madam Speaker. Anyone that can remember that, they spent $40,000 to advertise that on a rocket being launched out of Queensland back in November 2018. And I'll tell you what, that tourism strategy has never been seen since. They spent $5,000 on a Christmas tree, Madam Speaker. So here we are. Yes, they delivered some infrastructure, Madam Speaker, but the results clearly did not match the scale of the total debt that we've seen. Too many projects were delayed, unfinished, or significantly more expensive than planned. There was too much borrowing on funded deficits rather than durable assets, things that would help to grow the economy in the Northern Territory. Madam Speaker, Territorians can accept that borrowing when they can point to clear outcomes. The problem is debt without matching value. Government's emphasis is productive infrastructure and better financial discipline. Madam Speaker, in closing, Labor delivered less growth, less certainty and less security. This government is focused on growth, certainty and security. Labor grew the debt. This government is trying to grow the economy. In my electorate alone, Madam Speaker, we're supporting mining, we're supporting the gas industry, we're supporting agriculture, and 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼𝘏 has just recently been signed to grow the Sun Cable project in my electorate. Madam Speaker, we're getting on with the job, trying to fix the mess that Labor left us.
Member for Fannie Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Treasurer's Ministerial Report on managing Labor's debt legacy. Madam Speaker, is it a little bit chilly in here today, or is that just because we're talking about Labor's debt legacy? I'm not quite sure. We might want to turn up the heat a little bit because the CLP are in control now, so it'll get warmer for sure. We know that between 2016 and 2024, Labor held government here in the Northern Territory. Now, combined with the national Labor's catastrophe under Prime Minister Albanese, our economy has been driven into the ground by reckless spending, soaring debt and chronic mismanagement, a litany of bad decisions by failed ministers and ideological obsessions that stifles growth, not just in the Territory, but nationwide. Labor has left the Territorian families and businesses struggling, with federal policies exacerbating our local woes through higher costs, regulatory burdens and missed opportunities. Today, under the Whanokēaro CLP government, we are delivering real results. The fastest economic growth in the nation and a clear path to recovery, with targeted support especially for small businesses, families and everybody in electorates like Fannie Bay. We are prioritising construction projects we know are vital to unleash jobs and housing, despite the black hole that Labor bequeathed us. Anti-Labor ruled for 19 of the last 23 years, inheriting a post-INPEX boom, but squandering it with disastrous calls, like former Chief Minister Michael Gunner's lockdown extremes and election rorts, misusing taxpayer funds to fly ministers to remote polling days in 2020, prompting ICAC probes that dragged on without resolution. Eva Lawler, as Treasurer, oversaw an economy shrinking 5.25%, yet lifted intervention-era alcohol bans she later admitted were a catastrophic mistake, unleashing crime spikes. Her cabinet reeled from integrity failures under Natasha Files, who resigned in disgrace. Locally, they left a net debt of over $11 billion, the highest per capita in Australia, racing to a $15 billion debt ceiling from vanity projects like the Darwin Turf Club, while building approvals cratered and construction stalled amid their fiscal recklessness. Labor's welfare-first policies foster a culture where too many choose not to work, inflating our unemployment and slashing our GST share as federal formulas penalising our low own source revenue, We've seen GST drops before, and Labor's dependency trap made us vulnerable, starving infrastructure funding. NT Labor's soft on crime strategy, along with its history of misallocating funds, fueled the worst national economic tag, with crime scaring tourism. Their mining tax echoed Canberra's resource grabs, delaying Beetaloo and Darwin Harbour. Madam Speaker, under Labor, scandals piled up. Chansey Paech's share in alcohol suppliers amid community harm, CFMEU ditched Labor for poor leadership, and Gunners staff for rorts, all while productivity flatlined nationally.
Member for Fannie Bay, don't refer to members by their personal names.
Sorry, I take it back. The member for Gwoja. CommSec nailed their legacy. Weakest economy, zero vision, Territorians footing the bill. Madam Speaker, from Files to Potter to the member for Gwoja, Labor minister's failures destroyed opportunities for all Territorians. Elected in a landslide in August 2024, the Whanokāore CLP government hit the ground running with our rebuilding the economy strategy, fixing Labor's messes for Fannie Bay small businesses, families and residents, while making construction a top priority to build homes, roads and jobs we desperately need. We slashed approvals 50% via the Fast Track Task Force. We are accelerating projects and housing precincts. We're saving Fannie Bay, Parap, Coconut Grove, cafes and shops up to nearly $55,000 yearly by payroll reform. But it's not an easy task, Madam Speaker. Labor's $11 billion plus debt bomb and operating deficits mean every construction dollar must be hard fought, redirecting waste from their pet projects to essentials like housing upgrades and urban land release in Greater Darwin. It's vital for electorates like Fannie Bay. First home grants rose to $50,000 for Fannie Bay couples. Homegrown delivered $12.6 million to over 900 locals. Families gained childcare subsidies, school vouchers, a $1.5 billion law and order strategy with 146 new police. We are cutting crime to ensure Territorians feel safe and we grow the population. It's something that Labor never cared about and they did nothing to improve. 18 months later, GSP is up 6.8% and we are at the top nationally. Growth is at 10.2%. Population growth is up for the first time in so long. All these positives are boosting electorates like Fannie Bay and fuelling construction demand. Debt has slowed. Revenue is up $369 million. We have amazing CommSec results. Housing approvals up 15%, which is proof our construction push is working despite Labor's inheritance. It is absolutely amazing that those opposite cannot understand one simple fact, and that is safer streets here in the Territory will drive investment. From ship lifts to remote roads, we can create a safer Territory. The people, the investment and the subsequent improvements will come. Madam Speaker, Territorians will see that our best days are coming under a proactive, responsible and Territory-focused CLP government. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers? Member for Blain.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to make my contribution on this very important ministerial report today. Before I kick off, I'd just like to put some things on the record. So the member for Johnston does love to talk about how we don't get any royalties from gas. Member for Johnston, I suggest you go and talk to the federal government and the member for Solomon, because it's the federal government offshore gas which is reported in the media as not bringing in royalties. Anything that's offshore, the federal government owns those royalties. Anything that's onshore, the NT government gets those royalties. So that's why we back Beetaloo, because not only is it going to bring jobs and growth to the Territory and fuel our economy and keep the lights on in this wonderful building by keeping the gas flowing to Channel Island and being exported to bring real cash into the Territory, we also get the royalties. So mate, it will be coming.
Can you direct your comments through me?
Through the
no
chair.
Interjections, please.
Yes, we will be reporting those royalties in due course. Member for Drysdale, I love your comments about crashing the car and blaming the mechanic for the bill, because that really kind of sums up the opposition's approach to our budget. 8 long years of fiscal mismanagement. And then we come in and I was born in the 80s, Madam Speaker. I've lived through a few political cycles, and I seem to observe that always what seems to happen is that Labor governments get in and they run up the credit card bill and, and make a mess of things, and then the public throw them out, and then the coalition, in this case the CLP, come in and they fix up the budget, repair the infrastructure, get everything ticking along nicely, and then Labor come along and throw mud, get back in, and they've got a nice, fat balanced book to go spending again. They love nothing more than promising to spend other people's money. So anyway, that's just what I've noticed. Member for Opposition, her comments on leasing the port. For the record, it's important to note that the former opposition leader, the former member for Fannie Bay, the Honourable Michael Gunner, was the Labor representative on the select committee into leasing the port. And I'm happy to be corrected. I don't think there was any dissenting report that he submitted. My understanding is that he signed off on that report. So before the election, on the committee, he was all for it. Happy days. In the lead up to the election, CLP sold the port. That was their favourite attack line. Because he understood that it was required. The port required significant investment to fully unleash its potential. And he understood that, and on the committee he supported that. But then, once it became political, much like the opposition this week, we're facing an unprecedented, the biggest natural disaster that's hit the territory in decades. And what do we have? We have the Labor opposition politicising it, trying to politicise it and why haven't you done this and why haven't you done that? When the Chief Minister has very well explained exactly what we're doing, dealing, the Chief Minister is working 24 hours a day, the Treasurer is out there on the ground in the rain, with the tradies, getting the pumps sorted out, getting all the generators in place, getting things plugged in so that, the good people of Darwin and Palmerston, can rely that their water will be in the taps and, we can get off this boil water restriction advice, sorry. We're off. Are we off? Happy days. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We're off the boil water notice. I can't wait to announce to my constituents that they will be very happy. My kids will be very happy to be drinking from the bubbler again at school. We had to pack them up with bottles to go off to school, so they weren't happy about that. But, Madam Speaker, I love history because history always informs us about how we arrive to where we are. So, 2016, and it's been well ventilated in this place, the then CLP government, when they finished their term, but the net debt was approximately $2 billion. There's different amounts. I hear the media reports 1.7 at the end of their term. Approximately $2 billion, let's round up. But by the end of financial year 23-24, after 8 long years of Labor government, audited net debt stood at approximately $9 billion. So from 2 to 9, that's an increase of, well over 6, nearly almost $7 billion over 8 years. And, what do we have to show for it? Shadeless shade structure, we did have, I was a bit disappointed. The member for Barclay, I think, brought up boundless possible. I was hoping to get in on that one. That was, what a joke. A grammatical misnomer that was, apparently copied from another jurisdiction. And that boundless possible was meant to solve our population woes. As soon as they launched that, it was like something out of Utopia. As soon as they launch, I can just see them sitting up there, planning like, oh, we're going to have a launch. Well, what are we going to do? Oh, we don't need that, but look at the video. Oh, it's so amazing. We just need a tag to put in at the end. Utopia was meant to be a comedy, not a documentary. I think maybe the Gunner government was, watching it for ideas and inspiration. Project Sea Dragon, so many millions of dollars on a road to nowhere. Ship lift, oh my goodness. We're committed to, the original plan for the ship lift was $100 million as an incentive for an equity stake for the private sector and, and hopefully the federal government to come in, build a ship lift that would be a common use facility to draw business to Darwin. And what did we end up with? $800 million giveaway to the private sector. I think the chair of that committee said it was the largest transfer from public to private funds in the history of the territory. We are locked into that contract. It's been stated multiple times that if we tried to cancel that contract, we would be liable for the amounts in that contract. So this is the economic management. I'm running low on time, so I'd just like to quickly get into the history. So 2016, yes, INPEX was winding down. 𝘿𝙀𝘽𝘼 was spooling up. I have people in Palmerston who were running businesses and they were very, very busy in 2016 shipping oil and gas parts down to the 𝘿𝙀𝘼, supporting the drilling industry, getting everything ready. Change of government, Gunner comes in. As Labor love to do, there's an industry they don't like. They knocked it on the head. They introduced the moratorium. And how long was the gas industry dead for? 3, 4 long years before they lifted it? Finally, the former Chief Minister, the member for Nightcliff, Natasha Files, went down to Canberra and spruiked the gas industry, but it was too late. The horse had bolted, because what I've said in this House before, what the Labor Party do not understand, they think that the private sector is like the public sector, that you can just turn business on and off. You can say, all right, we're just going to stop the live export cattle trade. We're just going to stop development of the 𝘿𝙀𝘼 gas basin, and then we'll go away and we'll, do a moratorium and get some political run out of it. And then if we ever need it, we'll just turn it back on again. But what they don't understand is it's a supply chain. All the businesses along that supply chain that feed each other, and they're all actively working together. And when you stop a key point, you cut that chain, and that's the end of it. So I had people who, their business went under. They had subcontractors, truckies who were running all the gear down to the Barclay. Their subbies lost their contracts because there was nothing to take, nowhere to take it to. They had mortgages, so they were all stuck. So Michael Gunner scrapped the 𝘿𝙀𝘼 development 2016, and without that and a complete lack of economic vision, 2017 they had a series of talk fests that really didn't achieve anything. 2018, Ken Vowles and other members of the Labor caucus were concerned about the trajectory of the budget. They raised those issues in Cabinet. What was the result? Well, in December 2018, Michael Gunner jets off to New Zealand to have a holiday with his lovely wife, trots out the Treasurer, former member for Wanguri, Nicole Mannison, to face the music and dump the bad news. He's on holidays. Then Ken Vowles' email gets leaked to the media. Gunner races back from New Zealand. Territory debt, not important. Trouble in the caucus, he was back on the next plane back. And what happened then? Caucus meeting, those 3 members gone. Madam Speaker, my final note is that Labor's record was not growth in output, growth in productivity or growth in certainty, it was growth in debt.
Members, there